Welcome to Channel's Business Global with me, Juliana Olayinka, from our studios here in London. Over the next half an hour, we'll be looking beyond the business headlines by giving you in-depth perspective on the stories that are affecting all of us. Coming up on today's show, after a marathon summit that exposed some bitter resentment within the EU bloc, the group have agreed to an unprecedented €750 billion COVID-19 rescue fund. I'll be speaking with Colin Stevens, the publisher of the EU Reporter, about the details behind the historic deal. And despite significant COVID-19 disruptions, East Africa remains the continent's fastest growing region. Agnes Gittauer, Government and Corporations Consultant at GBS Africa, will be joining me to tell us more about the African Development Bank's forecast. Then later, I'll be discussing how the West can continue to do business with China with security expert Temitope Olodo. Before those discussions, here's our business correspondent Simon Pusey with a breakdown of the biggest business stories trending in Britain this week. Simon, no surprise, there's another week, another set of gloomy data about the British economy, and this time it's about borrowing.
Yeah, well, last month we reported that the borrowing the government had been making during the coronavirus pandemic had overtaken the entire size of the economy. That was the levels of government spend. Now it's got even worse, even bigger. The government borrowed £127.9 billion between April and June of this year. That's obviously during those coronavirus months. The figure is more than double what was borrowed in the whole of last year. So these are sort of crazy statistics coming out. June was actually lower than May. May saw record government borrowing of £35.5 billion. And people are saying that the reopening of retailers and gradual going back to work meant that June was not as bad as May, but May was the worst month. The ONS says that this has gone on the Office of National Statistics. As a lot of this has gone on the furlough scheme and many other schemes that the government have created to try and help workers at this time. Apparently there's been more than 30 coronavirus support schemes announced and in place by Rishi Sunak and the UK government to try to get the economy moving again. This obviously doesn't tell the whole story. Government borrowing is just one aspect, and I guess a kind of positive side on it is that every pound borrowed by someone is a pound lent by someone else. So someone is doing well in this equation, and obviously when the government is borrowing, it's a sign that somebody else is saving, and right now that somebody else is households. So households up and down the UK may be losing jobs and worried about the future, but often their bank balances will actually be looking all right because, believe it or not, when the shops shut and the restaurants close, people don't have that many places to spend their money. So Bank of England data is showing that the last 2 months we've reduced our debt as individuals and families by £12 billion. And we've added £41 billion to our bank deposits. So closing shops forces us to save, obviously. And more good news is, according to the Bank of England's chief economist, the economy has clawed back about half of the output, the fall in output that it saw during the peak coronavirus. So we've heard a lot about the sort of V-shaped recovery. Well, maybe this is it. Andy Haldane is telling MPs that there has been somewhat of a V-shaped recovery, although it's not as quick as a lot of economists were hoping for, and not as quick as definitely the government were hoping for. But it looks like, despite that record levels of government borrowing that are sort of eye-watering, that maybe the economy is gradually getting back to where it should be.
Gosh, I'll hold you to that statement, Simon. Thank you very much. Here's some other business news from across the globe. On the fifth day of intense talks, EU heads of state agreed in the early hours to an unprecedented €750 billion COVID-19 rescue fund, plus a €1 trillion budget for the next 7 years. Under the deal struck on Tuesday, Italy will receive the largest share of the stimulus money, with Spain receiving the second largest. Though some northern nations wanted a smaller rescue package with tighter conditions, German Chancellor Angela Merkel and French President Emmanuel Macron pushed back. For more on this, I'm joined by Colin Stevens, the publisher of the Brussels-based European multimedia news platform EU Reporter. Colin Stevens, thank you so much for joining me on Channel's Business Global. Nice to see that you got back to Brussels just in time for a major story. The European Council President Charles Michel has called this recovery package a good deal. I'm not sure all of the other members would agree with him.
No, I think you're probably right, but it is an agreement. That's the important thing. And everybody managed to get something they could take back to sell to their home audience. The so-called frugals, Netherlands, Austria, Sweden and Denmark were happy. They can go home and present the rebates they've secured. Poland and Hungary got what they wanted because of the rule of law conditionality has been weakened, and they can present it to their home audience. Italy and Spain are pretty happy as well. The final calculations aren't available, but it looks that more likely they'll be net contributors. They'll change from being contributors to net recipients. Not too sure where all this money's coming from, because there seems to be a lot of money that's being distributed. But across the board, I think it was a long, hard meeting, but they've come to a conclusion that everybody can live with. Whether they're happy with, I'm not sure.
Yeah, that's a great analysis there. You spoke about some of the countries. Here in Britain, Germany have kind of been heralded for the swift recovery, low infections. France, they will not be as economically hit as Britain. And of course, there are so many pictures on social media of Brits flocking to Italy and Spain. What about the rest of the continent? How do you think they fared in handling this pandemic? You're in Belgium. How's it been there?
Well, everything's slightly ahead of the UK. I mean, I've noticed that everything's a lot more open here. The crisis came to a peak earlier here. Life is much easier in Brussels. I have to tell you, the bars, the restaurants, the shops are all open, which is not necessarily the case in the UK. Whether this will actually, cause a second spike to the virus, and whether it will have been a mistake, only time can tell.
We are hearing about second spikes everywhere, I think particularly in Spain, actually. Of course, there's this, it's not a corridor, but Britain have allowed some tourists to travel into some regions and come back and not self-isolate. But I believe Spain may soon be removed from that list. Let's talk about that mammoth 5-day session. Netherlands, they've been described pretty much like how the Brits once were, trying to knuckle down with negotiations, not happy about going forward. Do you think there could potentially be some scarring that's been brought to the surface over the past couple of days because of this recovery deal?
I think that's possible. I think behind the scenes, the Netherlands did take over from the UK as being the awkward person in the room. There are reports that there was actually one argument over dinner between Macron and Rutte, with Macron actually banging his fist on the table. I think there will be scars, but it's the whole thing about the EU and the European Council is that they'll say things behind doors, but they'll come out with a show of unity. So.
And that's what they did, didn't they, Colin? 5 days after this agreement. I've got to ask you about Brexit, of course, because you can't discuss Brussels without discussing Downing Street in some way, shape or form. There was a lot of pressure at the peak of the pandemic for Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister, to shift that transition date. They said no, under no terms. Is Brexit still a big discussion on the continent? Of course, COVID-19 may have pushed it away a little bit, but are there still concerns about that?
No, I don't think there are. I think everybody's accepted that the UK is leaving. I think everyone has accepted the UK is leaving on the 31st of December. The only discussion, I think, is that if we do crash out, if the UK does crash out without an agreement, it's going to cost a lot of money to the EU. They're going to lose a vast contribution. So I think there's concern in the Commission and in the corridors of power that a deal is done so they don't lose all that UK money. But I think in general, the man in the street doesn't care.
Colin Stevens, a publisher, the EU reporter, thank you so much for joining me on Channel's Business Global from Brussels. Thank you. East Africa remains the fastest growing region according to this year's African Development Bank's East Africa Regional Economic Outlook. Prior to the COVID-19 pandemic, the region's economic growth was projected at more than 5%, well above the continent's average of 3.3% and the global average of 2.9%. The economic disruption caused by the COVID-19 pandemic has affected growth in many ways, such as falling commodity prices and trade and restrictions on travel, with a consequent negative impact on tourism. Let's discuss more of the report with Agnes Gitau, a government and corporations consultant at GBS Africa, a company that aims to foster intra-Africa and intra-Commonwealth trade. Agnes Gitau, it's always a pleasure to have you on Channel's Business Global. Thank you for talking to us, especially about East Africa, because I know you're the lady that knows the region very well. And it's interesting because I did discuss the African Development Bank's forecast on the show, but the headline we focused on was the fact that FDI was decreasing in that region, not the fact, the most important story is that you are still the fastest growing region in sub-Saharan Africa. Tell us more about it.
Thank you, Juliana, and always for giving East Africa a profile. I appreciate that. But you're absolutely right. After such gloomy news throughout the year, I think it's important to just speak on some positive news. Yes, the region is going to grow at 1.2%. This is not so good. Remember, we were estimating to grow at 5.1%. But if you compare it to the rest of the region, which is contracting by 1.7%, it is certainly some positive news, but yet we're still not out of the woods yet, Juliana.
You're not out of the woods yet. And it's interesting, actually, because when I was reading further into the report, there was a lot of discussion about COVID, which is why the growth rate has decreased. But then also locusts. You know, the locust plague is really affecting a lot of work. A lot of people have lost their jobs. A lot of people lost a lot of their crops. When you were discussing this, the report via that remote meeting, was there a lot of attention given to this plague?
You know, Juliana, you and I spoke some times back when I said that the locust invasion in East Africa had more COVID early in March, way more than COVID-19. Yes, the locust invasion has caused losses of about $8.5 billion, and this is to the agriculture sector. Yes, what this means, it means that pastoralists who were mostly affected by the invasion will be highly affected, job losses. So exactly, we are facing dual pandemic in the region, COVID-19 and the locust invasion. But yeah, we're still looking a little bit positive if you compare us to the rest of the sub-Saharan Africa.
What about travel and tourism? I've got to say, that's another area or sector that East Africa are doing far beyond what's happening in the West. But that surely is going to be a major issue because people are just not travelling. How significant do you think that downturn is? Do you believe there could be potential scarring to the sector, like we've seen with airlines? The likes of British Airways are saying they don't expect to see pre-COVID passenger numbers for at least 4 years.
Yes, Juliana, one of the reasons why the region has done well in the last sort of 5 years is because we've transitioned from depending on the agriculture sector to the services sector. And yes, tourism and financial services contribute highly to East Africa's growth. And with the global pandemic, it means our connection to the international market. It means that our tourism sector that employs at least 20 million people across the East African region has highly been affected. So, yes, I think what the government and policymakers are doing is to try and encourage regional tourism, domestic tourism, to grow the tourism sector from the external shocks that we've experienced due to the international market.
We're running out of time, Agnes, but I've got to ask you about an important point of the report, which is the emphasis on developing the region's workforce for the future. Can you tell me a little bit more about this briefly?
Yes, we need to change our education system to serve the demand for services sector skills. Remember, we've transitioned from the agriculture sector to services sector, so there is a demand for highly qualified people who can serve our services sector. So yes, certainly, if the region is going to grow and is going to have equitable growth, we must be able to have high quality jobs for our people. So yes, that is why the Africa Development Bank focused on skills for the future. So as the economy is transition, it is important to ensure that we have human capital to be able to serve our sectors.
Well, thank you so much, Agnes Gitau. I did want to discuss with you, the delay in the African Free Trade Agreement, but I'll save that for next time because your views on that are really important to me and our viewers. But Agnes Gitau, for now, thank you for joining me on Channels Business Global. In a moment, I'll be speaking with security expert Temitope Olodo. But before then, here's some company news for you. The major British retailer Marks & Spencer will axe 950 staff in the first wave of a cull that will hit thousands of workers. The announcement comes after department store John Lewis and health and beauty store Boots have already shed thousands of staff in the wake of the coronavirus pandemic, with at least 65,000 jobs currently at risk across the country. Britain's high streets have been hammered by the crisis as millions of shoppers move to online shopping. Experts predict there'll eventually be 250,000 redundancies across the sector. And more job cuts, this time from the professional networking site LinkedIn. The firm is expected to cut 960 jobs worldwide after being hit by firms recruiting fewer staff amid the coronavirus pandemic. The cuts will affect about 6% of the company's workforce across the globe. In a message, Chief Executive Ryan Wozlansky said these were the only layoffs the firm was planning. Microsoft-owned LinkedIn has offices in more than 30 cities around the world and employs 16,000 people. The Royal Bank of Scotland formally changed its name to NatWest Group on Wednesday, removing Scotland from the name of the lender's parent company for the first time since it was founded in Edinburgh in 1727. The banking group remains headquartered in the city, and the name change will not affect RBS Bank branches, most of which are in Scotland or Ulster Bank locations in Northern Ireland. Now, over to our next discussion. US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo has been in London this week to discuss China with a cross-group of MPs, urging Westminster to distance itself from what America considers a grip from Beijing's strongholds. The UK has followed Washington's lead in recent weeks and has taken a harder line against Beijing, U-turning on its decision to allow Chinese tech firm Huawei involvement in the British 5G network and suspending its extradition agreement and arms exports to Hong Kong. But with China fast becoming the world's strongest economy, how can Britain and the rest of the West remain a strategic partner of the superpower amidst increased tensions? Let's ask preventative terrorism expert and president of the Africa Security Forum, Temitope Olodo. Mr. Temitope Olodo, thank you so much for joining me on Channels Business Global. It's always a pleasure having your expertise. What a tense couple of weeks it's been. Do you think that UK-China golden era relations are over?
There's no doubt in my mind that the current situation is eroding the trust and confidence between the two big nations. And as we could see, the UK have been pulling their punches in the last few months, with the issue of the Muslim minority, the issue of the Huawei, the telephone company, and now this with the extradition treaty that they are putting a suspension to. This is a jab at China, and we know they will retaliate because they have dealt with Canada and other countries that have crossed their paths. So we are a bit concerned, and we're hoping that this issue could be resolved amicably, through diplomatic processes.
Well, I suppose that would be the hopes and wishes for diplomats and China. As soon as Britain announced last week that they were doing a massive U-turn on the Huawei 5G infrastructure decision, China did say that they do hope that Britain would change their mind. Others have actually described this decision as a bad decision. Now, you're a security expert. I know Britain put it down to a technical clause, but do you think there are genuine national security concerns as being emphasised by US President Donald Trump?
I think there are two camps here, and each camp is looking at providing a future projection of how the UK relationship and UK security should be looked at. Where you have a nation who seems to actually specialize in building infrastructure, so they are getting into our water system, they're getting into our nuclear energy for electricity. We could become hostage, to the Chinese authority, as we've seen in Africa with some of the countries where they're more or less taking over. And I think that is what some of the concerns that have been raised, by security analysts that, you know what, we need to pause a bit. We're not saying that Chinese companies should not be involved in some of the infrastructure because we're a global village. But we're talking of a situation where if we don't check some of their involvement, they might actually take over. That is the concern from some parties. And I've got my reservation from a technological perspective. Seeing what is happening in Africa and some other countries, one has to be very careful about how you involve other countries in your national security infrastructure.
Absolutely, and I know that point is another show in itself, isn't it, about China's firm grip on the continent. Mike Pompeo, US Secretary of State, he has been in London this week. He met with his counterpart, the Foreign Secretary Dominic Raab. And of course, Mike Pompeo is he doesn't mince his words. He's in the right Washington administration, isn't he? And he put out some pretty scandalous, unsubstantiated attacks on China, especially their relationship with the World Health Organization and their handling of the pandemic. And it brings me back to my main question, which is how does the West do business with China? Does the economic benefits from the relationship between both sides, does that trump the kind of slinging match that's going on? Or is this potentially a Cold War?
It is a Cold War. Let's put it the way it is. The only difference now is that we are now in the digital era, where the war is not picking up weapons against each other, but using cyber space as the venue or the theater of war. And we could see from some of the allegations that have come out about the Russians trying to penetrate and trying to get some of the research work from the Oxford University in terms of the vaccine. Who is going to win this war? Is a war of technology. And I think that is where we're going to. And what you found out, and it's very clear, is that when 2-3 Western countries start coming together, China sees himself as being bullied, being the dog that is being caged or that they're attempting to cage. And China will definitely fight back. The president of the United States have continued to use the phrase, the China vaccine, China COVID-19, China virus. And that is more or less pushing that narrative to say China is the bad apple in our midst. And I think we need to find a way to resolve this issue, because some of the countries that have raised concern is that why all the other countries around the world are now trying to cope with the impact of the COVID-19 that originated from China. China is now in a position where they are now importing products and saying COVID-19, machine, they are the ones producing all the equipment. The PPE scandal that in the UK, where most of the things that were brought in from Turkey and the others were not even fit for purpose. That is where the problem is, and that's why all countries now are reviewing, their strategy and how they give other countries assets, into the supply chain and issues of procurement.
We're running out of time here. We're coming to the end of the show, but I've got to ask you in just a minute or less, please, and you're happy to go global with this. How much is a threat to the world, digital security? How much of a threat is digital security to the world?
It's a big threat. It's a big threat because we're seeing certain specific countries without mentioning names who seem to send out their dogs. I'll call them their dogs, to intimidate countries that do not, align with their national interests. So when a country raises concern, they go after their technology, they go after their information, and information is power. If you are able to come up with a sanitizer that doesn't need alcohol and you are able to put it out there, you might get millions of people buying it from around the world, from the Muslim community or the Muslim world. Now, if somebody steals that product or specification from you, that's the end of your edge. So technology is important, and the Internet of Things coming in, every country now needs to safeguard and develop their own digital security strategy to make sure that they are not actually leaving themselves open to invasion from other countries in this digital advancement and race.
Thank you so much, Temi Topo-Olodo, there for that thorough analysis. Thanks for joining me on Channels Business Global.
Thank you very much for having me.
Sadly, that's all we have time for today, but do get in touch with your comments and suggestions. I'll see you at the same time next week for more in-depth business analysis on Channels Business Global. Goodbye.